Thank you. Good morning, or actually good afternoon now. Thank you for coming today on a Friday, cold winter Friday. Um, my name is Alan Lumba. I'm in the history department. I'm a postdoc in the Society of Fellows. But today's talk was organized by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and it was sponsored by the International Institute. And so today I just get to swoop in and introduce someone. I didn't do the organizing, but I get to introduce fantastic speaker today, Professor McKenna. Um, and so Rebecca Tino McKenna, I don't actually know if I pronounced your middle name, received her PhD in history at Yale University and is now an assistant professor at Notre Dame, or the University of Notre Dame. She teaches courses in American social and cultural history and on the history of the U.S. in the world. Her first book, American Imperial Pastoral, The Architecture of U.S. Colonialism in the Philippines, has been published by the University of Chicago Press. It'll be coming out on January 20th, so congratulations on that. This project, or her project, examines Baguio, a U.S. colonial hill station in the Philippines designed by Daniel Burnham, as a way to explore the literal and more figurative architecture of the United States' new empire. Today she will present her paper titled Cordillera Capital, Baguio and the Architecture of U.S. Colonialism in the Philippines. So please help me in welcoming Professor McKenna.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Alan, for that introduction. And I have to say, I'm very pleased to be here, delighted to be here. So thank you again for that introduction. Thanks also to Allison Burns for all the legwork in getting me here. I appreciate all your emails and help. I'm very, very excited to be here, but also, frankly, a little bit nervous coming to you, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, as an Americanist. So I do feel a little bit nervous, but this is a great opportunity, and I'm awfully glad to be here, and also to be thinking about a place that's decidedly warmer than where we are today. Although the spot that I'll be talking about today, Baguio, in the Cordillera Mountains of northern Luzon, that largest island of the Philippine archipelago, was adored by Americans in the early 20th century precisely because its temperatures were cooler than those of the Manila political capital and the rest of the lowlands. In fact, one colonialist thought to mark the salubrious climate by referring to the ruddiness of mestizo children's cheeks, kind of a sign of just how great that climate would be for white colonialists. And the spot in the Cordillera Mountains that I'd like to talk about again is this town, Baguio, that is pointed to with that upper arrow, and the lower arrow points to the political capital of Manila. And what I'd like to do is introduce you to this place, give you some sense of how I've written about it in the book project that I've just completed. And actually, I happen to have just one copy of the book with me. That's about all I've been granted by my publisher so far. But in any case, from there, zoom in into the Baguio town site and discuss what the history of this small place in the mountains might tell us about the big topic of U.S. colonialism in the Philippines. What becomes manifest from this perch, one removed, as I said, from the political capital of the colony, not just geographically, but also in terms of its history and its culture? What comes into focus about early U.S. colonialism in the Philippines to about the 1920s, and how we study it in centering this place, its land, and built environment. So let me first introduce Baguio just a bit further. As many of you may know, it was no ordinary place in the first decades of U.S. rule in the Philippines. It became, as Western visitors at the time believed, America's Shimla, that hill station in British India that had inspired the stories of Rudyard Kipling. And of course, this very point that American visitors were commonly comparing Baguio to Shimla is an implicit sort of swipe at that boogeyman of U.S. history, American exceptionalism. And further to that point, in developing this spot, Americans took their cue from their Spanish predecessors who had similar plans for a hill station on this in Baguio, plans that were foiled by Filipinos' revolution. During the early period of U.S. rule, Colonial Baguio, which sits in the province of Benguet, comprised some 21 square miles of land by 1907. Today, it's about roughly a 5-hour drive from Manila. In the 1900s, however, before a road was completed to shorten the trip, the journey consumed something like 24 hours over sea and then several days on horseback west, or east rather. But the journey was worth it to early American visitors. For resting some 5,000 feet above sea level, Baguio enjoyed those cooler temperatures that some believed were vital to white colonialists' health and their tenure on the archipelago. Many feared the debilitating effects of the tropical heat. It was believed to precipitate cases of what was called Filipinitis, or more generically tropical neurasthenia, with symptoms like irritability and exhaustion and anemia. If traveling back to the U.S. had been easy and cheap, American colonialists would have gone to San Francisco, but the trip was quite costly, so Americans pursued this retreat at Baguio, a place to ward off Filipinitis and reproduce American colonial labor. By about 1910, Baguio operated as Americans' summer capital, featuring a city hall and governor general's mansion, a government office complex, a hospital, a retreat for the colony's school teachers, a military reservation, a school for training officers of the Philippine Constabulary, a colonial police force, a marketplace, and cottages and dorms for government workers. And when the mercury rose in Manila, leading government officials and their clerks would close shop and conduct their work in the mountains. So in 1911, for example, some 250 American and 350 Filipino employees went up to Baguio. To the protagonist of Filipino novelist Carlos Bulosan's America's in the Heart, by the 1920s, the retreat had become, quote, a small city in the heart of tall mountains where the weather is always temperate. The roads are asphalt and the most modern and beautiful in the Philippines. The houses and theaters are built in Western fashion. Tall pine trees cover the mountains, and at night one can hear the leaves singing in the slight wind from the deep canyons beyond the city. I think as this passage from Bulosan's America's in the Heart implies, by the 1920s, Baguio was renowned both for its modern amenities and for its non-human nature. Its much celebrated pine trees, golf course, polo field. It was a picturesque American garden growing in the sublime Cordillera Mountains, a literal green zone, and thanks to its natural and built environments, a place unlike most any other in the Philippines. So if the archipelago was supposed to be the pearl of the Orient under U.S. rule, Baguio was the luminous pearl of the Philippines. Now, one of those Americans who had much to do with the development of Baguio was the Chicago urban planner Daniel Burnham, perhaps most famous for his work on Chicago skyscrapers and the 1893 White City of the World's Fair held in Chicago. He was recruited to design a new plan for Manila and also for Baguio. And following his visit to Baguio in 1904, he prepared a design largely in the City Beautiful style. So this was an aesthetic and also a practice associated with progressives like Burnham, who hoped to temper the haphazard growth of late 19th century cities with planning and mitigate social conflict through carefully designed public spaces like parks. These shared spaces, City Beautiful advocates held might help bring commercial imperatives and civic commitments into better balance and cultivate democratic culture. As a style, the City Beautiful drew on the neoclassical and is denoted by the axial design of city streets, the massing of buildings, and the provision of open space and parks around them, some of which you can sort of make out here. This was a style owing to the European Beaux-Arts tradition. In fact, Burnham revered Baron Haussmann, Napoleon Bonaparte's planner. And in this respect, inasmuch as the neoclassic had been used to invoke Greek democracy and the Roman Republic, it was also an imperial style that Burnham chose to represent the United States in the Philippines. In this photograph, Daniel Burnham gazes over Baguio, land for which he would design an urban plan. And one might have the impression from an image like this that he worked largely over tabula rasa, but this was hardly the case. The land that would become Americans' Cordillera retreat had been a domain of Ibaloi people, the Ibaloi being an ethno-linguistic group included among those commonly referred to as Igorots, so peoples who were distinguished by the Spanish and in turn by Americans from the generally Hispanicized and Christianized Filipinos of the lowlands. I think if we know of Igorots today, we probably associate them with the exploitative World's Fairs, where they were exhibited, and National Geographic articles by Dean Worcester, for examples. But in the history of the Philippines, as you may know, Igorots stand out for having largely managed to avoid becoming subjects of Spanish rule, at least up until the mid-19th century. The incredible geography of the region they inhabited, the mountains, were a natural barrier to Spanish incursions, and the Igorots themselves posed challenges to Spanish authority, in some cases fighting, in other cases taking flight further into the mountains. The Igorots who dwelled in and around Baguio, the Ibaloi, had used a Nabaloi, so that's their language, a Nabaloi variation on Baguio to refer to a valley between current-day Baguio and the nearby town of La Trinidad. And they had used much of this land largely to graze their cattle, one of their chief symbols of wealth. So the grazing land would become the center of the hill station when one Ibaloi headman, Mateo Carino, to whom I'll return, gifted Americans a portion of this land. So in my book project, I tell of the transformation of this land from the later part of Spanish colonial rule through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Its transformation from a place that had been subject to relatively limited Spanish colonial state authority to a place where Americans could claim a distinct zone of colonial power. And I narrate a simultaneous transformation from Benguet land as fodder for cattle into land as picturesque views, parks for play, and gardens, all central to Burnham's City Beautiful plans and deemed crucial to Americans' physical and cultural reproduction. So this then is a story of the transformation of Ibaloi land into American capital, and from Ibaloi pasture into what I call American pastoral, the dream of an ideal middle ground, harmonizing nature, commerce, and culture, and an ideal given expression in Burnham's City Beautiful designs. Drawing on those plans, government reports, correspondence, travel accounts, photographs, Philippine newspapers, among other sources, I structured the book as a sort of tour of some of the more storied sites in Baguio. So like, for instance, let's go to that. One of these being the 26-mile zigzag road that Americans had built to reach the hill station. And this is a site that allows me to think through how Americans recruited labor for this project and how Philippine peoples defied them. I take readers into the town site and a dispute over some of its land and Burnham's plan for the space, which is something I'll come back to. I take readers into the Baguio marketplace, which attracted significant attention for the infamous trade in dogs that took place there. And here I try to work through colonial market ideology. And then finally, I take readers into Colonial Baguio's inner sancta, the Baguio Country Club, and then Topside, the private home of Baguio's biggest American booster, William Cameron Forbes, who invited friends and political opponents, Americans, Igorots, and Filipinos, from former Revolutionary General Emilio Aguinaldo to future Philippine President Manuel Quezon, to partake of the green grounds and gardens of Topside and the Country Club, where incidentally, they could play golf with Igorot caddies in tow. And this was all in the hopes, I think, of winning their approval for Baguio and arguably for U.S. policy in the colony. These sites, a road, a marketplace, a country club, and private home may seem somewhat quotidian, not the sites of seemingly kind of obvious imperial power. And of course, the project itself does take us away from the Manila political capital. But to me, these are valuable places for exploring the interplay of coercive and non-coercive methods of rule, forms of power that were formal and informal, in sort of the broadest senses of those terms, and for bringing to the fore the agency of non-elite Filipinos, like some of the Ibaloi, and certainly some of the elite Ibaloi too, who dwelled in Baguio, and the Filipinos who worked along Benguet Road and left behind few written records, despite arguably inspiring and pushing Americans into this retreat. By the end of this journey through Baguio, so by the 1920s, a class of American progressives like Burnham, William Howard Taft, and forest conservationist Gifford Pinchot, all of whom had made a Pacific crossing to the Philippines, had cut their teeth as colonial administrators, and the hill station had become a showplace, as one colonialist put it, the owner of Topside put it that way, of what the United States offered, and a performance space for setting in motion new relations of obligation and debt. I argue in the book, and this is, I think, where my work differs in emphasis from some of the other studies on the hill station, that Baguio helped to consolidate a Filipino comprador elite and create a reserve of labor who worked projects like the road to Baguio and who, like the Filipino writer Carlos Bulosan, would cross the Pacific eventually for work. And in part through Baguio, Americans made Igorot peoples instrumental to U.S. rule. And asking readers to dwell on and in this place, small as it may be, I'm aiming to remind them that the building of 20th century U.S. imperial power, so often taken as abstract, invisible, or even elusive, as it's been variously called, entailed conquests of territory and transformations of land. Indeed, we could reasonably set Baguio aside zones like that around the Panama Canal, where practitioners of the City Beautiful had also drafted plans for a model American town, an enclave, or U.S. military compounds, which exist in over 40 countries and territories. So these relatively small spaces have facilitated U.S. power in the world in distinct ways, and have also made the U.S. vulnerable in other ways. So in short, my point is that U.S. imperialism and colonial relations were built in place. So now the conquest of territory and these transformations of land is what I'd like to turn to for the remainder of my talk. And with that, let me bring back Daniel Burnham, gazing here over Baguio land. And so this comes from probably late 1904. He was there in December of that year, assessing what was referred to as the Baguio Government Reservation. And this government reservation was a creation of a 1903 colonial government resolution that had cordoned off some 5 square miles of Baguio to remain exempt from settlement and claim, as they put it. And I think it's important to note here how Americans distinguished and marked Baguio as colonial territory. It was what I have been calling a sort of special province within a special province. Its home province of Benguet was the first province in the Philippines actually to be granted local civil governments in 1900, a time when Americans and Filipinos were very much in the thick of battle. American commissioners justified this move, a shift from military to civilian control, by identifying the population of Benguet as predominantly Igorot and claiming that conditions in the province demanded greater control by the insular government. Within several years of gaining civil government, Benguet was deemed one of the colony's special provinces. The 1905 Special Provinces Act, which initially applied to Benguet and 2 other northern Luzon provinces, and then 2 islands southwest of Manila, defined the colonial government's relationship to the Philippines' so-called non-Christian provinces, excluding what Americans call the Moro province. And so, of course, again, non-Christian being a way that the Spanish had categorized Philippine peoples and some Philippine peoples, and this is one that Americans retained. The logic of this special provinces measure was consistent with that providing for civil government in Benguet, and it was implicit in the 1902 Organic Act, which besides setting up insular government in the colony, also made for those areas inhabited by non-Christians to be under the direct authority of the Philippine Commission, so the colony's main governing body in these early years. The thinking went that these peoples needed protection from Filipinos who were viewed as predatory, as prone to take advantage of their less civilized neighbors. So the point is, Baguio existed within a special province, accorded unique treatment by the colonial government, and Baguio itself would be distinguished again when it later joined the city of Manila, the Department of Mindanao and Sulu, municipal governments and provincial governments as one of 5 units that the colonial government recognized, and it administered the city of Baguio directly. So in these respects, when we think of U.S. rule in Baguio, we might usefully consider the historian Lauren Benton's observation that imperial powers generated and maintained what she calls highly variegated legal geographies. The swaths of primary colors on imperial maps of the world are deceptive, it would seem, because Benton sort of suggests, even in the most paradigmatic cases, an empire spaces were politically fragmented and legally differentiated. I think in many respects, this is what Americans were doing in Baguio and Benguet, creating a unique jurisdictional geography. And they were also, in this way, advancing centuries of Spanish attempts to bring the region and its peoples under the authority of the colonial state. And again, Americans were doing so by insisting on this region's and Baguio's separateness, their distinctiveness from elsewhere on the archipelago, and the necessity of protecting the region's peoples. And where were the peoples of Baguio? Look at a photograph like this. Well, across the Baguio hills, one would find some, if relatively fewer, Igorot dwellings. These structures and their arrangement across Baguio and the greater province hinted at the colonial past. In fact, the dispersed settlement pattern of the Ibaloi was understood even at this time as a response to Spanish incursions in the region, incursions in the name of gold and convert seeking. The settlement pattern across Baguio also hinted at Ibaloi's agricultural and husbandry practices, growing camotes, rice in some instances, and rearing cattle. And I think in this respect, the Ibaloi are not unlike the upland Southeast Asians written about by anthropologist James Scott. While the story is somewhat more complicated for Ibaloi elites who did engage in negotiations and accommodations with the Spanish, it's fair to say that Igorots had for centuries been largely successful evaders of the Spanish tribute and labor-seeking colonial state. And again, the social geography of Baguio expressed some of that history. So in these ways, Burnham gazed over land with a very complicated past. And several years after his visit, ownership of some of these lands would become an especially fraught question. Some land over which Baguio native and Ibaloi Mateo Carino claimed ownership was seized by an order of the U.S. president for a future military reservation. So this would become known as Camp John Hay, named after the author of the Open Door Notes. Defending his claim to this land unsuccessfully in colonial courts, Carino's case would go to the U.S. Supreme Court. His challenge raised the issue of what U.S. sovereignty would mean for the Cordillera's indigenous people. And its resolution, much like the plans that Burnham would draw for Baguio, I argue, suggest a vision for a benevolent and even ennobled form of colonialism. So here's Mateo Carino. He was known, if not to Burnham, then certainly to some of the earliest American visitors to the region. The Carinos had been very powerful Benguet family for generations, one that had amassed a substantial wealth in gold and cattle. Mateo himself claimed some 370 acres of land, which he had used to pasture cattle, just as his ancestors did, and also in some cases to raise camotes. Perhaps following the example of his ancestors, who had at times chosen paths of accommodation with the Spanish, either out of simple self-defense or in order to protect secure their wealth, Mateo gave some of his land to the U.S. colonial government. In fact, his home, seen here, became the center of Americans' Hill Station in early 1903. In acquiring this land, the government added to holdings it had secured earlier in the fall of 1901. And then, in October 1903, the U.S. government claimed yet another piece of Baguio land for that military reservation. And so here's a map of Baguio from a travel guide, 1919, kind of sketch of Baguio, and with just an arrow pointing to the space that I'm talking about. It's labeled Camp John Hay. And so it was over a portion of that land that Carino asserted ownership. In the court case that followed, it became clear that Mateo had inherited the land in question from his father. He testified that just before his father died, through a ritual called a Canyao, where the Ibaloi communities gathered for at least a day of food and drink, the land passed down to Mateo. And he maintained old fences, some sod, some wire, that his father had set up and that he himself had promoted to limit the spread of disease among Ibaloi people's livestock. I think as this act of enclosure indicates, the Ibaloi did possess a concept of individual and group land rights, rights whose spatial and temporal scopes were determined by the amount of labor applied and improvements made to a particular piece of land. Now, not long after the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, and after at least 40 years in the Carino family, the land appeared destined for new ownership. The case revealed that in 1901, Mateo had agreed to option some of the land in question to an American merchant based in Manila. To complete the transaction, Mateo had to acquire proper title. So that year, he successfully managed to secure title from the Colonial Court of Land Registration, an effort that had followed attempts to secure written title to the property much earlier in the 1890s under the Spanish. The U.S. colonial government, already set on Baguio as home to its summer capital and military reservation, had contested this application of Carino's. And when overruled in 1904, the insular government made a successful appeal to the Court of First Instance in Benguet. Mateo would challenge that decision in the Philippine Supreme Court, but to no avail. In the course of their proceedings, both colonial courts conceded that Carino and his ancestors had occupied the land for decades, but both also held that Mateo had never enjoyed proper title to it. And indeed, despite two efforts to comply with Spanish royal decrees in the 1890s, Mateo had never been accorded written title. He and his brother Juan testified that the Spanish officials assured them that they need not secure such documentation. Their elevated status and their ownership were recognized and would never be denied. But in those last years of Spanish rule, that promise could have seemed somewhat insufficient to Carreños. An 1893 mortgage law had been created to finally afford a comprehensive land registration scheme in the colony. And then the Mora law, the Spanish regime's last law on land rights, followed in 1894. Ostensibly, the Mora law was to provide Philippine peoples with access to land for agricultural cultivation, but its details amounted to a reversal of Spain's historic respect for customary land rights. The Mora law allowed the regime to claim as state property all lands except those held by owners possessing legal titles. So in other words, and at least in theory, undocumented customary land rights would no longer be recognized by the colonial state as they long had been. From early in their occupation, Americans followed that policy, and it was reflected in their 1902 Public Lands Act. That law did allow native settlers to secure free patent to lands in the public domain. But we have to note here that Americans claimed public domain to characterize about 9/10 of the Philippine landmass. So for those without the resources and the wherewithal to pursue and secure documentary titles, unlike Carreño, this meant the loss of a measure of security through customary rights in land. Now, unlike the other special provinces, Benguet had initially been excluded from that Public Lands Act and that promise of an opportunity to secure title. But by 1905, Benguet Provincial Governor William Pack was pushing for the province's incorporation. For one thing, inhabitants themselves were apparently clamoring for it. The governor offered other reasons to apply the law to Benguet. So he said this, quote, "The sooner the nomadic style of cultivation of land is stopped, the sooner indigenous peoples would be anchored to one place, rendering taxation a simpler and more profitable enterprise for the colonial state." Further, Pack believed that extension of the law would ultimately make clear which lands lay squarely within the public domain and potentially available for auction. So the governor wrote here, quote, "We would then be in a position to exploit this district to the homesteader or land leaser." And to be sure, there had been an interest in developing Baguio lands as whispers of Cordillera gold reached Americans in the colony. So by early 1906, the portion of the Public Lands Act that gave native settlers a means to secure free titles was extended to Benguet. By summer of the following year, the governor believed that natives of Benguet had had sufficient time to secure patents, and it was now time that the province come under the whole of the Land Act, which would make homestead leasing opportunities widely available. And so it was in this context of developing land laws and their extension to Benguet and the development of public and private interests, investments, too, in the province, that the U.S. insular government considered Carreño's assertions of ownership and rejected them. The Philippine Supreme Court, siding with the insular government, offered this analogy to make sense of Carreño's claim. Quote, "We do not understand that a person in possession of unsurveyed public land in the state of Minnesota, for example, whose ancestors had occupied that land for 40 years, could maintain in court a claim that he was the legal owner of the lands by reason of the presumption that the United States had granted the land to his ancestors, a presumption founded not upon any proceedings taken in the General Land Office to acquire a patent, but upon the mere possession for that length of time." So the justices likened Carreño to a white squatter in the U.S. Middle West. And yet in the ruling, they also marked Carreño's difference as an Igorot. They rejected the notion that Carreño could ever have pursued title to the land. Noting the Spanish failure to convert Igorots to Christianity, the court deemed incredible the possibility that these uncivilized people might have understood and used the land laws as Carreño appeared to have done. Instead, drawing on testimony from Benguet Governor Pack, the government suggested that Carreño possessed the land only through his status of what they called his status as chieftain. Pack testified that while Carreño's reputation was impeccable, quote, "Igorot chieftains like him, simply by force of character, maintained their dominant sway over large tracts of land in the province." This representation of Carreño was actually quite problematic to imply that Carreño was not well acquainted with individual property rights was to overlook his efforts to maintain enclosures surrounding his land and register his land in the 1890s. But such was the government's argument. There was no reliable basis to Carreño's claim of ownership. Having failed to secure title under the Spanish, the land rested in the public domain and remained in that state in the passage to U.S. sovereignty. Carreño was effectively a trespasser, as they put it, on public land. Well, Carino had very powerful counsel crafting a response. His attorneys before the U.S. Supreme Court included Frederick Couder, who had engineered several of the first insular cases. On behalf of clients seeking free trade between the new colonies and the mainland, Couder had argued for recognition of the United States' new possessions as domestic, as part of the United States for tariff purposes. When they took on Carino's case, Couder and his partners, possibly envisioning the future investments in the region, the possibility of future investments in the region, they argued for recognition of the Ibaloi's property rights. To them, the implications of the government's claim were ludicrous. The requirement that Carino show paper title from the Spanish regime meant that, quote, the whole Igorot nation may be driven as lawless squatters. Couder also advanced anthropological knowledge to explain Ibaloi understandings of property and argue that, quote, Carino held the land according to the laws and customs of his people. Carino's attorney also drew on Spanish colonial law. Quote, whatever may have been the brutality of the fierce conquistadors, their law recognized and protected the rights of native occupants of its Indian possessions even more fully and scrupulously than our government has done in the case of its Indian wards. Still, the lawyers identified American precedent for recognizing Carino's claims, arguing that, quote, American courts have uniformly held that the individual possession of the American Indian to his land as sacred. So while the U.S. government might enjoy sovereignty over the nation state, it did not enjoy property rights to Indian lands, they argued, and it followed then for the Philippine colony. All of the attorneys made their cases by analyzing their clients' circumstances in light of legal pluralism and imperial precedent. The fall of 1907, the case finally made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and when he wrote his opinion in early 1909, the year that a city charter was drafted for Baguio, and by which time Burnham had come and gone, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes also made comparisons to the United States' earlier territorial annexations in addressing what he took as the central question of facing the court, quote, whether the plaintiff owns the land. Holmes's response largely followed the case made by Carino's attorneys. So upon review of Spanish law and in setting these policies next to U.S. congressional legislation on the colony, Holmes ruled for Carino. He concluded that, quote, Spain did not assume to convert all the native inhabitants of the Philippines into trespassers or even tenants at will. The Spanish had indeed accorded indigenous peoples the means with which to secure title to land over which they asserted ownership. And so for this reason, to maintain that in the transition of sovereignty, Carino became a mere trespasser, as the insular government would have it, would, quote, amount to a denial of native titles throughout an important part of the island of Luzon, Holmes concluded. I think we can take Holmes's opinion as a statement of the meaning of U.S. imperial sovereignty. So for one, he explained what it meant to the Cordillera's indigenous people. Holmes held that Americans' pledge in the Organic Act of 1902, which held that, quote, all the property and rights acquired by the United States are to be administered for the benefit of the inhabitants thereof, surely included those savage tribes of Benguet, and was not exclusive to the Hispanicized and Christianized Filipinos of the lowlands. That initial promise contained in the Organic Act would be violated and rendered void were the colonial government to treat as public land what the Igorots, by native custom and by long association, as he put it, one of the profoundest factors in human thought, regarded as their own. That's Holmes there. I think here Holmes, as some of you may know, set precedent for the recognition of native title in the Philippines with legal power to this day. So it was a seed of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which came in the late 90s. And also, the Carino case would be cited in another case regarding Baguio lands that was also decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in that same year, 1909, later in 1909. So Holmes had recognized difference. Carino represented one of what he called the savage tribes of the Philippines, but he also maintained the applicability of property rights. These were to be protected even if custom of non-Christians rather than written documentation evidenced ownership. Second, Holmes's ruling, affirming a means by which all Philippine peoples could claim land rights, also asserted U.S. sovereignty over that part of Luzon that had long existed beyond the operable authority of the Spanish colonial state. In this way, even as Holmes's decision recognized indigenous land rights, it arguably also advanced colonial jurisdiction and state-building efforts in the Cordillera begun under the Spanish, helping Americans then to accomplish what the Spanish largely did not. And then finally, in framing his opinion as he did, Holmes articulated the very mission of the United States' overseas empire. Quote, "The acquisition of the Philippines was not like the settlement of the white race in the United States. Whatever consideration may have been shown to the North American Indians, the dominant purpose of the whites in America was to occupy the land," he wrote. "The reason for our taking over the Philippines was different. Here, our first object in the internal administration of the islands is to do justice to the natives, not to exploit their country for private gain." So to me, this kind of comparison that he's making, or rather contrast, is quite striking. Carino's attorneys had also likened Mateo to a Native American and called on the United States' past dealings with indigenous peoples of North America to justify a finding for the Ibaloi. But Holmes made the case for difference, at least in regard to imperial intentions and their colonial consequences, an understanding that departed from the views of stalwart imperialists like Albert Beveridge and Theodore Roosevelt, who had justified the annexation and retention of the Philippines by invoking that history of Indian dispossession in the U.S. West. To Holmes, settler colonialism and the practices of the United States' extracontinental empire should diverge. This contrast could make the latter look more innocuous, even benevolent. So these are a few headlines covering the Carino, the verdict of the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. It is notable that the insular government also made an argument for distinctiveness, but along different lines. Its attorneys asserted that Supreme Court decisions, U.S. Supreme Court decisions on the tribal rights of Indians have no possible application in the case. That's what they insisted. Quote, "Those cases were decided with relation to the rights of Indians conferred by treaty, or relating to tribal lands or reservations made by the government of the United States." Ironically, the government and the Supreme Court made these arguments just as the Supreme Court was helping to attenuate the significance of those treaties, and in that way, Native people's sovereignty. The court's 1903 Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock decision reflected this change, for the court's ruling advanced the process of allotment without tribal consent, and affirmed the view that Congress had the power to unilaterally terminate or ignore treaties. The effect of Lone Wolf then was to further undermine the status of Native Americans and make their condition not wholly unlike the indeterminate position of men and women in the United States' new possessions, which in the court's obfuscating formulation in the insular cases were foreign in a domestic sense. The effect of allotment and enclosure of sources of economic and in turn political sovereignty, as the historian David Chang has argued, was to create private property and advance state power in the U.S. West. So, even as Holmes was marking a distinction between the settlement of the U.S. West and the administration of the new insular possessions, the Supreme Court was also creating new and similar categories of subject peoples by making possible the alienation and commodification of land across the U.S. West, and concluding that the Constitution did not follow the American flag into the Philippines. Rhetorically, however, the court seemed inclined to emphasize distinction. While the dispossessions that attended expansion across the Old West were inevitable and necessary, in the new frontier it would be different. The court emphasized the temporal and spatial distance between these projects, denying, of course, the dispossessions that were underlying both. Though the court decided in his favor and called on a cash settlement for Mateo Carino, Mateo never enjoyed the fruit of his legal victory. He died, as I understand it, before the ruling came down, and further, ultimately, the colonial government avoided broad application of the Carino precedent. In practice, it blunted the potential power of Holmes's decision by continuing to embrace Spain's Regalian doctrine, which had held that all colonial lands, but for those which Philippine peoples had secured documented titles, belonged to the state. And of course, also by the time the court reached its verdict, Burnham's plans for Baguio were already underway. If Holmes's opinion had defined and legitimized U.S. imperial rule, associating it with benevolence and justice, Burnham's designs for Baguio land would operate in a similar way, shaping a model middle ground, uniting nature and civilization, commerce and culture for agents of a democratic republic undertaking imperial conquest. This was the making of what I have called an American imperial pastoral. So I'll conclude here by suggesting what this episode in this sort of small place on the Philippine archipelago and this contest over Baguio land, and truly then a contest over the culture, the politics, the capital accumulations it could condition, kind of historiographical payoffs, if you will, I think we might see here. So I think first at the broadest level, and as I sort of gestured to at the outset, I take this episode as a reminder that colonial rule and subjects of rule were built in and contested over in place. as abstract and as elusive as U.S. imperial power can seem to some. Americans clearly fought for their military reservation, believing Baguio to be crucial to the reproduction of white colonial labor in the colony. And they gained authority over it by distinct acts of dispossession, categorizing and governing it as a special province within a special province, seizing portions of Carino's land, and refashioning its geography and landscape as Burnham did. So discursive and material appropriations informed each other here as Americans transformed Ibaloi land into their own capital. So I think this is an example of how we can meaningfully link histories of state building with capital formation and pursue the commerce between cultural and racial and material forces shaping colonial subject and capital formation, and the ways in which economic and political sovereignty condition each other. So second, I think that the references and the analogies that all parties in the dispute made in order to understand Mateo Carino, his rights, and the reach and limits of U.S. sovereignty were not just to Spanish rule, but also to legal precedent built in the conquest of the U.S. West and the United States' historical relationship to native peoples in North America. It wasn't only that Americans made comparisons between supposedly uncivilized Philippine peoples and Indians to justify retention of the Philippines, but such rhetorical moves subsequently gave way to connected processes of creating colonial subjects and policies. And to me, this episode is a reminder that those of us interested in the history of the U.S. And the Philippines might fruitfully pursue both inter-imperial comparisons, which I think we're quite strong on, and also intra-colonial comparisons, both studying comparisons that were made at the time and making comparisons ourselves. By my lights, that intra-colonial comparisons that take us beyond the period of immediate imperial conquest, so that is beyond the war and arguments over annexation into the process of colonialism are fewer, and I wouldn't necessarily count my work among them, but this is something I've been intrigued by, and just sort of, incidentally, I've just gone back recently to a 1980 essay by Walter Williams, and he speculated there, this is the line from the essay, that the Philippines annexation, or he speculates that we might think of the Philippines annexation as the last episode of a 19th century pattern of territorial acquisition and direct political rule of subject people. So rather than looking forward, what connections might we want to continue drawing looking back, I think is the point. And third, and finally, I think this story shifts attention to the significance of the Cordillera Mountains and their dwellers, and in that way draws our attention toward less usual subjects, I think, in the writing on the U.S. and the Philippines in this period. Paul Kramer makes the point in his book, The Blood of Government, that by the 1910s, quote, struggles over the rule of non-Christians and over the rule of the islands as a whole would become inseparable. I couldn't agree more. Americans conjuring of the Igorot as noble savage in their World's Fairs exhibits and National Geographic essays, for examples, seem to serve as a justification for continued paternalist care of the entire archipelago. But it's important to remember that Igorots and their representation were not simply fought over by Filipinos and Americans dueling for authority and leverage. Men like Carino also intervened in this contest and did so with some fairly consequential results, at least in the long term. Thank you.
Can you wait till we're recording?
This is probably a dumb question, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. For Jojo Abanales, I don't know if you know his work, he's argued that we have to think about the colonial state in the American colonial state in the Philippines as having sort of two dimensions. One is a militarized one, and one is the civil type of formation that I think you described. Yeah. But I think Baguio has, just even the maps you've shown, has a particular space in between, and the way that indigenous people there were kind of conscripted in many ways. I'm just curious how the history that you are telling kind of looks at those different formations.
Yeah. Well, it is very interesting in this region, because this was one where I sort of talk about the first chapter of the book. It's sort of about the mountains and sort of the Igorots in the mountains and how the Spanish imagined them and tried to make them into proper colonial subjects. by the time Americans get there, the initial thinking was that, oh, this is going to be easy to kind of gain authority over this part of the Philippines because of what they perceive to be a historical antagonism between Cordillerans. I mean, I'm calling them Cordillerans. They weren't referred to that way at the time, but so Igorot peoples and peoples in the south and Filipinos. So this will be a piece of cake to gain authority, but it proved not to be the case at all for them. And in part because Filipinos were actually going up into the mountains to elude American forces. And so this became the sort of hotbed of insurgency, as it turned out. So there is some irony that Americans would sort of make their retreat in this place that was of some kind of questionable, would Americans be able to sort of gain control here? So, so I would sort of say that as background. So it was a place where that was sort of hotly contested in some ways, and where the guerrilla war was pursued. And I think the other kind of point, maybe where I would sort of come in there, is that when Americans made that move to make Benguet a place of civil government, to sort of set up civil government in the province very early, the first province in the Philippines where they allowed for that to happen, what I have read suggests that civil authorities, that is like Taft, wanted to sort of kind of pull that province out from military authority, that there was a sort of struggle between this personnel, between sort of military and the civilian. And they wanted it for kind of a number of different reasons, but wanted to secure it. So very much, I think, a contested space in that way. And then if you saw on the maps there, too, I had mentioned Camp John Hay is there. There eventually is a naval reservation. So a retreat for both the civilian and the military. And so maybe it goes back to that, this sort of being this, I've been sort of using this idea of the pastoral, this sort of middle ground and a sort of place apart from some of the politics, say, of the Manila political capital, but ultimately no clear retreat from some of these contests. So. Sorry.
I'm curious about the style of the architecture of the buildings themselves. Do they more reflect whatever style Daniel Burnham was interested in the time, in the landscape, in the function of the building, in the idea of imperial architecture? What did you see in those buildings?
Well, they're somewhat mixed in some ways. So I can head back. I had government. Burnham was actually quite taken with the Spanish architecture style in some respects. I thought I had it. Sorry, there we go. You can sort of make out a little bit there. And he thought that the Spanish had devised some smart responses to kind of what he was calling tropical conditions, so like in Manila. So archways, sort of the whitewash, kind of the use of stone. These are in the tile roofs. These he actually liked quite a lot. And so I sort of thought about this in some ways as there might be a parallel in colonial Gwendolyn Wright kind of talking about French design in Vietnam. She talks about sort of, I think it's called the associationalist style. So bringing in some of the indigenous forms, relatively indigenous forms, into the colonial architecture. And I think you can mark some of that, particularly in Manila. In Baguio, in terms of the layout of buildings, this to me is where the City Beautiful and the Beaux-Arts tradition comes in, this sort of arranging, the massing of buildings, this, again, provision of wide kind of open spaces between them for these processional spaces. So to me, this sort of smacks of that City Beautiful, Beaux-Arts kind of European tradition that you sort of see in some of the public spaces. But what's interesting is that Burnham also had a hand in designing topside, which you can sort of make out a little bit in that, both the country club and topside, William Cameron Forbes' private home. And here, I think, is a real kind of counterpoint to that kind of grand architecture. This is like the alpine, almost like an alpine retreat. It's the bungalow, which I talk about in one of my chapters, which is again, I think of it as the way in which the bungalow was talked about at this moment was an architecture that really kind of connected to the land, that it wasn't sort of going to stand out either for its materials, its the paint job. This is stone. This kind of sits flat to the earth at most 2 stories. And so I think what's sort of interesting is that so you have this sort of grand sort of style in the public spaces, and then for Forbes, who would become Governor General, he designs this very seemingly humble bungalow, But I think it sort of plays into this way in which Burnham was kind of navigating, along with William Cameron Forbes, the tensions of an imperial republic. So this was clearly a zone of imperial power, space of imperial power. Forbes is becoming the new headman by hosting his own canyaos. But it's in an architecture, it's in a space that is actually quite modest, and by design is supposed to be kind of close to the ground, part of nature. And I think, I mean, I sort of read it as that sort of balancing act in some way between kind of the ostentation that you might associate with sort of the big public spaces and the impressiveness of some of the size of some of those buildings, and then what you see here. There were also government cottages that those were painted white and often had green kind of iron roofs. And those would be like where the government officers or their clerks would go to. But I've talked a lot about this place and also the country club, I think, because these were really places where both Americans, but then Americans and Filipino elites would gather, and where they did some of their business in the summer months. Sorry. Yes, yes, he is. I think the grandson of Emerson.
Thank you. I really enjoyed listening to your talk. I know you're a historian, so this is likely an unfair question, but I want to pose it to you anyway. Do you know anything about the legacies of these things, whether it's the material form and the built environment, its use as a country club, as almost a rest and relaxation place for whether it's military or civilian American colonial government in today, and how Baguio is presented today, or how locals use it, or the armed forces of the Philippines have taken over campaigns. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's so much to say there. So, I mean, I think and there's some people who could correct me who have been to Baguio more recently and have even more exposure to it than I do, but in terms of its current use, as I understand it, Filipinos still go up to Baguio, say, come kind of Easter holidays, it's a place of retreat, but now for kind of more widely, it's been democratized in a sense, and no longer it's just the place for, these American elites or Filipino elites. Camp John Hay still exists, the country club still exists, as kind of go-to spots. During World War II, it became an internment camp for Americans in the Philippines, and it was also carpet bombed. Baguio was severely damaged in World War II. So I would say that too, but I guess maybe what I would go to, so the way I end the book is actually thinking about this sort of Camp John Hay now is sort of one of those kind of onshore, offshore spaces, in that there's I guess, what do they call it? Not a free trade zone, but I'm now blanking out. Yes, right. And so, the last time I was there, Texas Instruments had offices there. Calling centers are there. So it's this. Again, just as I'm trying to talk about here the way in which that this is this sort of exceptional space. Americans make it into an exceptional space by which that they're able to sort of rule that way. It's a way of rule, but then they're able to rule kind of in this exceptional space. And it's still an exceptional space in that companies that kind of set up shop there don't have to pay as many taxes. Filipino workers are advertised as being English speaking, kind of better. They're compared to workers of other ethnicities, and so there are these still exceptional spaces within Baguio that exist today. So I guess I would say that, but there's a great deal to say about it. There's a lot of continuing contest over these lands and who owns them, which again probably many of you know, with families, the Cariños, the Carantes contesting, and claiming ownership of considerable portions of Baguio. And so this case that I mentioned about Mateo Carino and how it sets precedent for ancestral rights, I mean, that's very much a live and very kind of dicey issue to this day. So I guess you could say that the Americans sort of set off a conflict that is very much ongoing in terms of who has rights to this land. That probably is the broadest answer there.
This is just a clarification of the term that you use to describe Baguio as the Cordillera capital. At what point during the American colonial period was Baguio ever considered the capital of Cordillera, which is pegging it to the area? I thought it was always called summer capital.
Yes.
Okay.
No, you're right. It was always called Cordillera Capital is my concoction, if you will. So that is to say, it is something that's been very kind of interesting and important to me is sort of thinking about the mountains and Americans retreating in some respects to the mountains. I sort of find Baguio incredibly interesting, both as a story of clearly American imperial power, kind of claiming this space and kind of basically building what they wish over it. But it was also a sign that they couldn't really hack it in Manila, and they needed respite either for kind of bodily regeneration or cultural regeneration. And I think kind of this retreat into the mountains, I think, has been something that's been quite interesting to me. So this was their capital in the mountains. I don't mean to they certainly used it during the summer months, so it was their summer capital, but I'm using Cordillera just as a descriptor. So not the Manila capital, but the Cordillera capital. So there were two capitals, effectively, in the Philippines. In that, commissioners were up there doing their work. William Cameron Forbes, in trying to gain acceptance and support for the hill station, wanted Filipinos to come up and do business up there, and he sort of figured once they get up here and they see how lovely it is, they'll buy in not just to Baguio and accept Baguio, but ostensibly the rest of the U.S. regime. So they, as I sort of see it, I'm using capital too as in a sort of way in which I'm thinking about that Americans take Ibaloi land and make it not into capital as Washington, D.C.'s capital, but capital as productive, as something that's productive to them, a social and cultural capital. And I think that's how Americans made it into that Ibaloi land, into social and cultural capital for themselves in their process of attempting to govern the Philippines.
Yeah, because I think that there was to be a Cordillera capital. It could have been Kiangan because they were, which is in Ifugao. It's more centrally located in the Cordilleras. And the Americans were trying to develop that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're not successful, of course.
Thank you.
Having recently been in Shimla, what strikes me with the buildings you've shown us is, in a sense, their modesty and nearly ambivalence. I mean, when we go to Indian hill stations, the British appear to have been trying to recreate Britain and then build a few. I'm thinking of the Governor General's house, for example, in Shimla, which is huge and magnificent, and that would be the garden shed for that.
Right.
So it seems to say something very different about how the Americans were perceiving the Philippines as a colony, and the dramatic contrast with the way the British viewed it.
Yeah. Yes, and I haven't read deeply in the history of Shimla, but there are all sorts of differences, I think. One of the most notable ones is, as I understand it, as I've read about Shimla, the center of the hill station remained the Anglican church. Not the case here. Burnham put the church, he called them subsidiary buildings, and they were sort of off the center of the town site. So I think that's one of the significant differences too. But you're right. I think that there is a certain modesty. I think part of it was just, kind of what were the resources that Americans had. Baguio was quite contested. So many Filipinos thought it really was just this retreat for this American elite, and really needed to be sort of turned around and sold, Baguio, in many respects. So it was kind of a politically kind of difficult, it was politically difficult to make Baguio happen, so there was all of that. But I guess, as I was saying before, I think I'm also trying to make a case that this design expresses something, as you say, about, I don't know if it's ambivalence, but a way in which Americans were trying to kind of negotiate between their purported democratic values and the fact that they were conducting imperialism. And I think there's a way in which the landscape sort of speaks for that attempt to negotiate the two. And I think about Baguio as the garden, as this middle ground, in a way in which Americans were trying to, on the one hand, this is civilization, this is city planning, and yet it's not over the top. It's still somehow connected to nature in some ways. So again, I don't want to overstate that, because there were very particular conditions why it looked the way it did, whether it's geography or politics. But I think maybe we can read the design as an expression of that of these contradictions that Americans were sorting through.
Yes, following up on that question, if we bring it within Southeast Asia and do a comparison with the other hill stations, the French in Dalat, the Dutch in Bandung, and the British in Burma, Myanmar, you would see a fundamental difference between the American hill station and other hill stations.
Became a cultural hub for the Americans? Was there ever a time that it became an exclusive zone, which meant that people that lived in the lowlands weren't really allowed to penetrate through Baguio? And if so, at what point did it actually change for ordinary people to actually appreciate the space?
Yeah. Well, so as I was saying before, in terms of who got to sort of visit Baguio, I mean, I was reading these quotes that had been saying that the Baguio Country Club is the pièce de résistance of the club menu in the U.S. colonial Philippines. So it was exclusive, it was desirable. But I said before, Forbes in particular recognized that Baguio would not continue to exist as the American summer capital without Filipinos accepting it and buying in and lending support to it. So, so to the extent to which he is inviting Filipinos, there are Philippine Commission sessions that are held up there, a legislative session that he wants to hold up there. At that point, you get to have Filipinos buying property. Now, these are obviously Filipino elites. There was a portion of the town that was designated to be for Filipinos. These were like a Filipino town site. So it was segregated in that respect, in where people lived, what property they got to buy or not. But there was kind of mixed socializing, if you will, in, say, the country club and topside. So that would be the opening, I would say, of where, you know, sort of Philippine peoples, but again, very much the elite were participating and consuming Baguio as Americans were. Maybe the other thing to note is that when, in 1913, once Woodrow Wilson comes into office, and Harrison comes into the Philippines as Governor General, he sort of thinks this is a big waste, and he actually stops the this kind of retreat for American workers and Filipino employees of the government up to Baguio. But what's said is that even at the end of his time, Baguio was very much bustling. It was actually only growing, and he came to sort of love it too. So, you know, my focus has been in sort of this early, kind of up to 1920s or so, and even up through this point, you can see some of that mixing. But as far as, I don't know if I could give you a date as to when does a city that was designed for about 25,000 become one where I think something like 200,000 or so come through every day. That comes much later, and again, given what happens during the war, that kind of that density of population is not going to come until later, is my sense.
I'd like to thank you all for coming to our first lecture of 2017. Happy New Year to you all. Could you join me in teaching the talk about the McKenna?
Thank you.